Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is about the New York Times rewriting their own climate history. These graphs from the National Climate Assessment show how much hotter summers used to be in the United States. Every metric shows how much hotter the U.S. used to be. The length of warm spells used to be much larger than it is now. Heat wave magnitude was much higher in the past than it is now. And the warmest temperature of the year was also much higher. This map shows in blue the locations in the United States which used to get much hotter. As you can see, most of the country used to get hotter than it does now. I often focus on the tremendous heat of the 1930s, which caused millions of people to flee the Great Plains and move to California. But today I'm going to be talking about heat waves which occurred a little earlier than that. On this date in 1925, there was an incredible heat wave going on in the eastern half of the United States. The Midwest was over 90 degrees every single day during June 1925, which in itself is pretty incredible. But the peak of the heat wave occurred on June 4th, June 5th, and June 6th, 1925. This map shows in red all the locations which were over 90 degrees on June 5th, 1925, and in purple it shows all the locations that were over 100 degrees that day. There were 100-degree temperatures all the way from Texas up to New York, and Michigan was 104 degrees that day. Can you imagine the hysteria from climate alarmists if we had that sort of heat in early June now? This animated GIF shows the progression of the heat wave from June 1st through June 7th, 1925. I'll let it run a couple times so you can see how the heat built and spread across the eastern U.S. Pretty stunning. We don't get widespread heat like that anymore in the United States, particularly not in early June. Now let's look at some of the stories from the New York Times from June 1925. New York Times, New York, Friday, June 5th, 1925. 9 killed by heat, many overcome, no sign of relief. Temperature reaches 95 degrees, highest June 4th on record in city's history. Humidity adds to torture, many hurt by falls from roofs or other places where they sought relief. Whole country broils. That last part is not really accurate. The western part of the country was actually quite cool, but in the east it was extremely hot. Here's the next day, New York Times, Saturday, June 6, 1925. Heat kills 21 here, 93 are overcome, may last for days. Official thermometer registers 96 at 4 p.m. while others show as high as 107. Hottest June 5th recorded. Some merchants declare full holiday today. Charity Society asks aid for the poor. Nation's casualties high. 5 days deaths reported to be 167. Many schools closed. New heat records upstate. And here's the next day. Sunday, June 7th, 1925. Heat kills 67 in city and environs. 6 days toll brings total to 99. Hope for relief in showers tonight. Nation's death list 300. Monday, June 8th, 1925. East wind breaks the long heat wave. New Yorkers dance for joy at relief. Days deaths 63. Total for a period 162. 13 drowned in crowds bathing near city. 750,000 people at Coney Island. Ocean is jammed from early morning by the resort's record crowd. Bathhouses are swamped. Trucks swing many from the city in bathing suits for an hour in the sea. It was incredibly hot in the same story in Washington, D.C. Washington Post, June 5th, 1925. 3 more dive in heat wave, 7 overcome with hundreds ill. No relief in sight, says forecaster. Mercury touches 99. In the same story in Washington on June 6th. Heat prostrates 5 on city's 6th sweltering day. Forecaster still unable to find relief from torrid wave. Thermometer here touches 100 mark. So we can see there was a really bad heat wave in June 1925. If we go back a little further to June 1901, we see a very similar heat wave which killed many people. June 29, 1901, heat brings death and much suffering. June 30th, 1901, New York wilts in protracted heat. Temperature on the street from 98 to 106 in the shade. Many dead and prostrated. Hospitals prepared for emergencies. Heavy mortality among horses. Rush to seaside resorts in search of relief. July 1st, 1901. The city of Furnace virtually deserted. July 2nd, 1901. Heat's holocaust in the five boroughs, 87 deaths and 178 prostrations, mark hottest July 1st on record. July 3rd, 1901. Heat brings death to over 200 persons. Tornado strikes Sing Sing prison. July 4th, 1901. 200 more dead before rain falls. And the heat wasn't just in the United States. New York Times, Friday, July 19th, 1901. The heat wave in Europe. Numerous deaths in London. Effects of drought serious. No signs of a change in England. New York Times, Sunday, August 11th, 1901. Unprecedented heat in Italy. Vineyards shriveled up. People forced to sleep in the open air. The thermometer in many parts of the country registers 43 centigrade, 109 Fahrenheit in the shade. The vineyards in entire districts have been shriveled up by the Scirocco and ruined to the very roots, as though set on fire. So we can see there was record heat in the United States and in Europe that summer. And if you asked the climate scientists to explain what caused it, they'd be at a loss, because carbon dioxide levels were really low at that time. Now let's go back to 1896. There was an incredible heat wave in New York in 1896 which killed 1,500 people. And January of 1896 was the hottest month on record in Australia. New York Times, August 18th, 1896. Hottest of hot waves on record. How it struck sweltering New South Wales in January last. Talking about hot weather, one day last January the mercury at Adelaide, Australia marked 127 degrees in the shade. And at the bottom of the article they list the temperatures during January of 1896 at one location in New South Wales. 112, 107, 112, 114, 118, 121, 123, 118, 118, 115, 117, 124, 117, 121, 120, 128, 128, 124, 120, 126, 120, 126, 129, 119. These temperatures were taken along the Darling River in proper shade at the station homestead, which is within 30 yards of the river. So we can see there was incredibly hot weather in Australia during January of 1896, and that summer in Europe was the same thing. July 17, 1896, heat wave in Europe, deaths from sunstroke. A great heat wave is at present being experienced in Europe. In England, numerous deaths by sunstroke have occurred. In Spain, the heat has been so intense that the very birds have been killed. 1896 brought a lot of other extreme weather, including a tornado which nearly destroyed St. Louis. We've heard a lot of hysteria about tornadoes in Kansas this year, but 1896 was much worse. April 25th, tornado in Clay County, Missouri, 5 persons killed and 17 injured. May 15th, Grayson and Denton Counties, Texas, 100 killed. May 24th, Polk and Jasper Counties, Iowa. Half the buildings in Valeria blown down and 15 people killed. May 25th, a tornado in the counties of Oakland, Lapeer, and Macomb, Michigan. 49 killed, many other injured. May 29th, tornado and cloudburst at Seneca, Missouri. 29 lives lost. June 9th, Wyeth City, Alabama. Tornado killed 15 people. 1896 also brought record heat to Arizona. They had a 7-day heat wave over 120 degrees, a record that's only been matched one other time in 1905. Once again, climate scientists would not be able to explain the extreme heat and extreme weather of 1896 because they blame everything on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide was at very low levels in 1896, just like it was in 1901, 1925, and all the hot years in the 1930s. Now let's go back a lot earlier. The history of the world droughts goes back to the year 627, when in France and Germany thousands of human beings died of thirst. In the year 1000, the rivers of Europe dried up and heaps of fish were left to putrefy and spread the plague that followed. In 1123, the Rhine River dried up in Alsace. During the Battle of Bella in 1260, more men died from heat than from wounds. In 1303 and 1304, the Rhine, the Loire, and Seine rivers ran dry. In 1779, many persons in Bologna were stifled. Shops all over Europe were closed for months. In 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 people died from heat in France. So it should be pretty obvious to everyone except for climate scientists and the press that heat waves are not associated with carbon dioxide. The worst heat waves occurred when carbon dioxide was much lower. But this video is about the New York Times. Let's go back to New York. The number of days above 95 degrees peaked in New York during the 1950s. In 1955, they had 16 days above 95 degrees. And in recent years, the number of 95-degree days has been plummeting down to record low levels. I'm going to repeat this now because this is very important. Heat in New York peaked in the 1950s. In recent years, have been going towards record low level number of hot days. Similar story at stations across the United States. There was a big peak in the 1950s and an even bigger peak back in the 1930s. The frequency of hot days in the United States has plummeted over the last century. If we go back and look at the graphs from the National Climate Assessment, we see the same thing as my graphs show. Heat peaked in the 1930s and the 1950s. And the Environmental Protection Agency shows exactly the same thing in their heat wave graphs. Heat peaked in the 1930s and never come close to that again. I've shown you lots and lots of articles of heat wave stories from the New York Times going back to the 19th century. Let's look now at how they're trying to rewrite their own history. New York Times, July 28, 2017. It's not your imagination. Summers are getting hotter. Extraordinarily hot summers, the kind that were virtually unheard of in the 1950s, have become commonplace. This is incredibly Orwellian. The worst heat waves in New York occurred during the 1950s. And heat wave intensity and duration has been plummeting in New York over the last 30 years. So everything in this article is exactly backwards. Summers are not getting hotter, and the worst heat waves occurred in the 1950s. And now the New York Times is trying to rewrite their own history to say that 1950s heat waves were virtually unheard of. Before I wrap this up, let's just look at a couple more graphs from New York. You can see that the number of 90-degree days has also declined sharply in New York since 1940. This graph is of particular interest to me. It shows that the average summer maximum temperature in New York has declined since the 1940s, with the hottest year being 1966. The reason this is interesting to me is because I used to spend summers at my grandparents' house on Long Island during the 1960s, and I remember it was so hot out that you usually couldn't sleep at night. And they had terrible droughts in the Northeast during the 1960s. In 1966, New York nearly ran out of water, and they were fighting with Philadelphia over the last water in the Delaware River. There was so little water in New York that summer that restaurants put up signs that said, "Water by request only," and you weren't allowed to water your lawn most of the time. The New York Times knows that their loyal readers will believe anything they say, no matter how absurd it is, and even if they completely rewrite their own history. I have several New York Times readers in my family, and I've noticed that it's impossible to reason facts with them. They believe the New York Times is some sort of unassailable authority, no matter how ridiculous the claims being made are. George Orwell said, "Early in life I've noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper. In no place is Orwell's statement more true than at the New York Times. All the fake news that's unfit to print." Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.